Welcome back to another edition of the Around the Block podcast from Coinbase. I'm your host, Justin Mart. And this week, we've come across a really fascinating and powerful analogy for how to think about blockchains, how to piece together what are layer one blockchains, what are layer two blockchains, what are rollups, this whole complicated world. But it turns out there's a relatively simple analogy that helps cut through all the complexity and help us all think more clearly about how these systems really work and what's coming down in the future. So today I'm talking with Haseeb Qureshi. He is the general partner at Dragonfly Capital, a venture capital firm in crypto. And he's the one that's populated and thought about this analogy. And it has to do with how blockchains can be thought of as cities and how all the different layer ones, layer twos, rollups, et cetera, can basically be explained in terms of cities. So there's a lot to get into. Let's start unpacking it now. Let's dive in. Part of the reason why it's great to have you on the podcast for the first time, hopefully one of many. But I read your blog post a couple months ago about this articulation about how blockchains could be viewed as cities. And every once in a while you run across mental frameworks that kind of like, oh, it's a great one. It makes so many things kind of a little bit clearer in your head. It crystallizes concepts a little bit more. And so that's kind of what we want to dig into here is this mental framework. This idea that blockchains can be viewed kind of like cities. But to kick it all off, actually, I want to just get your perspective on how you began to view blockchains as cities. What was kind of the genesis story there? What prompted that analogy?
That's a good question. The origin story for a lot of this actually is really from talking to a lot of folks who are less deep in crypto. So I think if you're in crypto and you've spent a lot of time in the layer one universe and you understand how why there are a lot of different blockchains, it's more intuitive. You don't necessarily need to explain to you why there are multiple blockchains. But for a lot of folks who are coming into the space, because there's been such a enormous widening of the tent within crypto. I have so many people coming to me, and I remember this in 2017. People would be like, "Why is there Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash and Litecoin? Like, why do you need three of them?" Then of course they didn't know that there was like 50 of them, but they thought there were only three Bitcoin clones. But so now there seems to be like this plethora of these smart contract chains that are very similar in principle to Ethereum. If you're just coming in and you don't know a whole lot about crypto, maybe not obvious what even is the difference between these smart contract chains. And so a lot of people would end up asking me like, well, isn't it just the case that obviously one of them is going to win and the rest of them are going to go away? And I think for most people in crypto, it's not obvious. It was unclear back in 2019, let's say, whether or not, you used to have this term Ethereum killer, which is this idea that all these new emerging layer ones were going to basically usurp Ethereum's place, and there was going to be no more Ethereum. There was just going to be these new blockchains that were going to kill Ethereum because Ethereum wasn't innovating fast enough. And I think it's really obvious to me that that's no longer going to happen, right? Even if these new emerging layer ones are going to be successful, and they did drop the name Ethereum killer. No one talks about quote unquote Ethereum killers anymore. As a sort of tacit recognition that is the wrong mental model for understanding what these blockchains are and how they're going to relate to each other. But for most people coming into crypto for the first time, it's not obvious why everyone started talking differently about these layer ones. And that's why when I was trying to explain this intuition that I have about why it seems really clear that these blockchains are going to coexist, how to explain that to people. And that's where I came up with the cities analogy. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. You're right, though. We haven't actually heard that Ethereum killer analogy in a long time. And there was a lot of fervor around, oh my gosh, we're just going to get a bigger, faster, better version. And clearly the superior technology is going to win because it fixes all of Ethereum's problems. It's a bit of a meta story to this because we're going to be talking about this analogy in particular, but I also have the sense that analogies are always imperfect in certain ways. They miss a lot of the nuances, and we've had many different mental frameworks, many different analogies in crypto over the years. But let's get into it. So exactly what do you mean by blockchains as cities? And let's flesh out this one in particular.
Yeah. So here's the way that I kind of draw out the analogy. So most people, when they're looking at blockchains for the first time, they think of blockchains as networks. That's the usual metaphor that we use for blockchains, understanding them as networks. But if you think of a blockchain purely as a network in the abstract sense, right, then you think of it, okay, network like the internet, like Facebook, like one of these social networks or one of these integral networks that underlie the internet. And these networks, if blockchains are like these networks, then that means they have network effects. It means they're fully extensible. It means they can grow arbitrarily big. And that generally means that only one version will win, right? There's only one IP, the Internet Communication Protocol. There's only one TCP. There's only one UDP. There aren't multiple competing standards that fight against each other.
It's because the network effect to drive the winner,
effects.
right? Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The network effects just make one person totally dominate. They sort of expand like a germ until they eat everything. And I argue that networks are actually a bad metaphor or a bad analogy to think about blockchains, because blockchains have a unique constraint that makes them not like those other networks. And the unique constraint of blockchains is the block space. Blockchains can only be so big. And the reason why they can only be so big is because if they were arbitrarily big, then it would require arbitrarily large resources in order to verify the blockchain. Right? So if you have a blockchain that has got tons and tons and tons of data in it, moving through it every single second, then if you want to actually verify the correctness of that blockchain on like a laptop, it would not be possible. You need like a supercomputer in order to verify everything that's going on a massively large blockchain. So blockchains have to be physically constrained. There's only so many transactions that can run through per unit time.
Yeah, this is actually a really critical distinction, right? I mean, as you say, this is kind of what's the foundation of this analogy as blockchains as cities is, hey, they're actually physically constrained to some degree. They cannot grow arbitrarily large. Just to crystallize that a little bit though, right? I mean, we have networks that grow very large. And blockchains, while a network isn't the perfect analogy, they kind of are a network though. There are nodes in this network and you can add nodes and take away nodes. And so it behaves like a network, but it is constrained in a certain sense. I just want to make sure that we're crystal clear on why it's constrained, right? You mentioned that it's this idea that, there can't be an arbitrarily large amount of compute happening on the blockchain because it has to be trustless at the end of the day. It has to be decentralized because the entire point of blockchains is that we don't have central parties that we have to trust in to accept the computation or accept the things that are happening. If we don't have decentralization, then we're basically just rebuilding the existing financial system or the existing networks and putting a different wrapper on it. So that critical element, the trustless element, is what makes blockchains different from everything else, but it's also what creates this constraint in how big they can grow.
Exactly. And so the common refrain is don't trust, verify. Meaning that if you cannot yourself verify the correctness of this blockchain, then you're trusting some third party. And if you're trusting some third party, then this thing requires trust. It requires trust from third parties. And in the Bitcoin white paper, the key line is we created a mechanism for I should be able to repeat these
Quote
words.
The
I feel like I'm in church, but it's something like without reliance on third parties, right? That's the important point, is the verification of a decentralized form of payment without reliance on third parties, meaning that everybody themselves knows that this thing is operating according to the fixed set of rules. No one is cheating. No one's inventing money out of thin air. Nobody is going out and doing protocol bailouts without anyone else knowing. Everybody is operating according to the rules, and that's what keeps the blockchain trustless. So
we say it's physically constrained. What are the ways in which this becomes physically constrained though, right? So clearly we can't have arbitrarily large, compute processes and things, but what's the practical limitation on the average person if they try to be trustless on the blockchain? Like what's the actual constraint there?
So the way that translates into your experience of the blockchain is it means that there are a few things that cannot be, there are a few constraints on the performance of that blockchain, right? So the first one is the latency. A blockchain cannot be arbitrarily fast. Why can it not be arbitrarily fast? So Bitcoin, for example, has 10-minute blocks. The only time Bitcoin transaction actually gets confirmed on average is about 10 minutes. Now, there's some variance in it. It's not exactly 10 minutes, but on average, it's about 10 minutes. Ethereum is I think it's 12, 13 seconds on average for between Ethereum blocks, meaning that between those 12-second intervals, nothing is happening on Ethereum. Literally zero things are happening until the next block shows up. Now, there's some blockchains that move faster than that. So Solana, for example, has blocks every 400 milliseconds, which is very, very fast. Avalanche is, between 1 and 2 seconds. Celo is every 5 seconds. So different blockchains parameterize the block time differently. But you cannot have a blockchain that has 50 millisecond block times. You can't have that. Why can't you have that? The answer is that because the blockchain needs to be, you need to have multiple people around the world achieving consensus, agreeing on the state of the blockchain before it moves forward every single block. Everyone needs to kind of get around a table and say, yes, I agree that in this decentralized network, we're all going to shake hands and say, cool, this is the new set of blocks, and we're going to move forward to the next one. In order to do that, you need people around the world to communicate. And for people around the world to communicate in these consensus protocols, it takes time, literally the time for the speed of light to transfer around the world.
Yeah.
And transfer between people in Asia and people in the U.S. and people in Europe, all of those messages that need to take place in order for everyone to vote on what's going to be the next block, it takes time. And that is the physical constraint on latency, right? So you cannot have a decentralized blockchain that generates blocks as fast as, like, let's say Google, right? Google, when you want to send a search query to Google, it happens as fast as the transit time from your computer to the data center that is serving Google requests nearest to you, right? So that can be in the order of about 30 milliseconds, or sometimes even smaller, depending on where you are geographically. No blockchain can operate that fast because of this constraint on decentralized, because of this constraint on consensus. The second constraint is in throughput.
Yes,
so
and this is the key one in my mind. Yeah, exactly.
Those are the two important parameters, right? Throughput is the amount of, so latency is how long it takes for a transaction to get confirmed. Throughput is the amount of transactions that can get done in a period of time. So if you imagine like a pipe with water flowing through it, the length of the pipe, how long it takes from water to go one end to the other, that's latency. The width of the pipe, how much stuff can be in there at any piece of time, that's the throughput. And so if you want to do 500 transactions per second, 1,000 transactions per second, 2,000 transactions per second, that is too high for what Ethereum can do, because Ethereum is constrained by its throughput. Now, why is the throughput constrained? The answer, there are two reasons. The basic reason is that the rule within Ethereum, and the thing that bounds Ethereum total throughput size, is that the Ethereum Foundation and the folks who are responsible for the maintenance of Ethereum believe it's very important that anybody with consumer hardware should be able to verify the Ethereum state. Meaning that if you are running all the transactions on Ethereum on your laptop, let's say, you should be able to keep up. If the throughput is too high, let's say the throughput is like thousands and thousands of transactions per second, then a normal person on a laptop would not be able to keep in sync with Ethereum. Mm-hmm. And now, why a laptop? Why that? Why is that the rule? The answer is that, well, that's just kind of what the culture of Ethereum has chosen. The answer is like, well, people just draw the rules somewhere differently. They kind of, based on some cultural artifacts, they choose the lines here or they choose the lines there. Solana decided that, like, hey, you should be able to verify this on hardware you can buy on AWS. And Avalanche decided the line is somewhere different, and other blockchains decide somewhere different. That's the rule for Ethereum. And that is why Ethereum transactions throughput is constrained where it is.
So maintaining decentralization is the core, the heart of cryptocurrency. And that actually is fundamentally what restricts the usability of these networks. You have to maintain the cost of validation needs to be low.
So I think a better mental model, given these facts, for understanding blockchains is thinking of them as cities. Now, why cities? So the first thing, of course, about cities is that cities are also physically constrained. Cities are also arguably networks, right? Like, so, a city like New York City, it's got hubs, it's got, roads, and people connect there. There's a lot of people who come together in New York City, but it is physically constrained. Cities cannot be arbitrarily big, right? But they have actually a lot of properties in common with blockchains. And so if you want to imagine blockchains as cities, the best way to understand why is it that we have, going back to this analogy of like, why is there Ethereum and Solana and Avalanche and all these other things? Well, so imagine that Ethereum is New York City. So Ethereum is New York City, and if you know anything about New York City, you know that New York City is a very important city. It's a popping place. There's amazing culture there. There's a lot of really wealthy people. Yeah. Some of the most important celebrities and most important companies in the world are based in New York. It's a very historic city, but it's also really friggin' expensive. It's crowded, it's congested,
it's got some problems.
Everything costs money. It's got some problems. It's really old, like the infrastructure is kind of crumbling in a lot of different ways. People love to complain about New York City, but they also know, they're like, look, the reason why all the people in New York City are there, despite all these problems, is that it is the most happening place in America, right? It is kind of pound for pound, per block, per sort of square mile, the most culturally significant, probably most wealthiest, most kind of cultural innovation is happening in New York City.
It speaks to it. It's expensive because it's important, right? People want to live there
Exactly.
because it's the cultural center, it's the financial center, and that dictates that, hey, there's a limited amount of real estate. New York City cannot expand out forever, right? Kind of why
Right.
this analogy works well with blockchains. And so the real estate that does exist ends up being much, much more valuable.
That's right. And so, if you compare that to Ethereum, it's kind of the same story, right? In New York, you've got the most important, banks and financial institutions. In Ethereum, you've got the most important DeFi protocols. They're all on Ethereum. You've got, the most important cultural institutions, celebrities, lots of television and things like that come from New York. It's also where you've got the biggest DAOs. You've got the most NFTs. You've got, the most interesting cultural moments, Constitution DAO and all this stuff. It all happened on Ethereum. And it's also got the most wealth, right? So New York is home to some of the richest people in the world. And the same thing is true for Ethereum.
Yeah, so this analogy ends up explaining a little bit about why we have other networks as well, right? I mean, Ethereum is New York City. It's the cultural center of crypto, of smart contract chains at least. Has so many things going for it, but as you say, it's expensive. It's broken in some ways. A lot of people rail against it because it's way too expensive for their uses. And so suddenly we have other cities popping up. Now the question I kind of have here, or at least my mental model is, why do we need other cities to begin with? And the answer is around scalability. We want these cities to be able to serve the purposes of everybody, but not everybody can live in New York City, right? Ethereum cannot possibly, scale by itself to the level to have millions and millions of transactions per second because, again, of that physical constraint we've already talked about. And so
a lot of people now are priced down, right? Like Ethereum fees are so high. It seems that, if you're a young, hungry artist, it's very tough to go to Manhattan today and go try to make a living there. Like you have to go find someplace new where it's more affordable and you can really build a life for yourself. And that's what a lot of people who find themselves on Ethereum say, look, Ethereum's great, but I can't afford it here. I'm too late. It's time for me to go somewhere new. And that's where you kind of open up the different doors to how you end up scaling a city.
Yeah.
Now, when you're scaling a city, there are multiple different approaches to how you scale. Let's say, okay, we know New York it's full, it's expensive. We want to scale past New York. How do we scale a city? There are a few different approaches. The first approach is to build up. So this is, in the real world, in real cities, that's called building skyscrapers, right? Investing in skyscraper technology. So New York, I can see behind you, there's some skyscrapers behind you in downtown Austin. Every major city, when they get full enough, they start building upward. And in Ethereum, the equivalent of this is rollups. Rollups are the equivalent of building upward, right? And why are rollups like building upward? So very briefly, just to summarize what a rollup is. So a rollup is a layer 2 solution, meaning it's a solution that's built on top of the underlying blockchain or on top of the underlying layer 1. It's sort of rooted in the layer 1. It's almost like a little mini blockchain, kind of extends out from the layer 1, but derives its security from the underlying layer 1. So it's not like a separate blockchain in the sense that you have to trust a whole new set of validators or trust a whole new set of Genesis block and all this other stuff. Instead, it has the same trust properties as the underlying blockchain in the same way that if you live in a high rise in Austin, the laws of Austin still apply to you. It's not, although it is physically different, it's sort of almost like a city that's built upwards on top of Austin, but really you're still in Austin. You still have the laws and the building codes and all the other things in Austin apply to you. And if you want to go downstairs and go see someone who's in another high rise, right? If you see someone in your high rise, it's nice. It's air conditioned the whole way. But if you want to go and see someone in another high rise, you have to go all the way down to the street. You have to go, take a cab or take an Uber or whatever, get across town and go to that other person's high rise. And that means that although you are living in this special space that has made a lot more space for you, it's a lot cheaper to live in a high rise than to live, in a house in Austin per se. But it requires you to still have to interact with the underlying city. You don't escape Austin just because you're living in a high rise. In the same way, if you live in a layer 2 on top of Ethereum, it allows you to have much lower fees than you'd have directly operating on top of Ethereum. But if you want to interact with somebody who's in a different rollup, you have to leave your rollup, go down to Ethereum, pay Ethereum fees, go into that other rollup, and there's also these exit games that require time, and there's all these issues with actually getting across town to go to the other rollup on Ethereum. And so rollups are a big part of the solution of how you scale a city, but they are not themselves sufficient to answer the entire. The answer was not we built high rises in New York and then no one ever left New York and everyone lives in New York now.
Speaks a little bit to the future of kind of where Ethereum and other base layer ones are heading, right? They themselves can't scale out large enough and fast enough, right? So you got to build up. Building up is how you actually achieve scale. But it kind of also begets the point about cities is you don't go to a city to just be on the streets. You go to be in other buildings. That's where the things are actually happening. Right. And so if we extend the analogy a little bit, it's looking forward, if Ethereum is going to scale, we have to kind of do it through rollups, which by the way, Vitalik and others have confirmed the future of Ethereum is rollup centric. It means that all the applications, all the utility, all the things you want to do are going to essentially live inside other skyscrapers. But those skyscrapers are still connected. They're still sitting on top of Ethereum. They're borrowed from Ethereum's security model. There's ways where they're really, really interconnected, right? So that I think is a very elegant example. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd say a lot of the things you want to do are going to be on rollups, but probably not all of them. right? So it's very likely, I mean, the same thing is true in Austin, right? Like not everything that you do in your time is in a high rise. Probably a lot of your time is spent inside air conditioned buildings, but sometimes it's like, oh, hey, I want to go to like a concert, and a concert requires you to be outside, right? Like it's only really interesting when you're outside. And so there will probably be some things similarly in Ethereum that most things, a lot of things are going to live on rollups, but some things that are like, look, I'm willing to pay the cost of being outside on the ground floor because what I do is so important. I don't want to be stuck inside a single building for everyone to be able to use me, right? So for example, like, when you go to bars, when you go downtown, to 6th Street or something in downtown Austin, right? Like those are on the ground floor. You're walking in and off the street to like actually go out because it's just not a good time to like go inside a building and go, technically they could do that, but it's just not, it's not as good of an experience. In the same way, I would imagine that something like Aave or Compound, which don't require an enormous amount of throughput, they don't require, which allow you to do on-chain borrowing and lending. Those are very low velocity applications. It's very likely those are not going to live in rollups. Those are probably just going to live directly on the Ethereum layer 1. And if you don't want to borrow large or small or large amounts, then fine, there's probably going to be another smaller borrowing protocol on a rollup that you can go use that's cheaper and faster. But if you want to borrow from the really big pool that all the whales are using and all the big guys are using, it's probably going to live directly on layer 1. And it's going to be more expensive, but people on layer 1 are willing to pay that cost.
Yeah, and there's certainly a lot of implications too around this. This mental framework's helpful because I think it's easy for people to wrap their heads around it, right? They can imagine cities, they can imagine how you scale a city, how you build a city, they can imagine the limitations there, right? And so in this case too, we're talking about reasons why applications might live on the base Ethereum chain and not on a rollup. Another reason is composability, right? If, composability, just, a simple quick definition of this, it's the ability for one application to interact with another application natively. And in a sort of atomic, single transaction type of fashion, not having to wait or travel somewhere else to pick up your laundry and then bring it over to the dryers, right? That's kind of like the idea of composability. You kind of lose that if you live in one skyscraper and you have to go to another skyscraper. And so composability does live on the base layer on the Ethereum main chain, and it does live inside each individual skyscraper, but it is a bit of a limitation in this example, right?
That's right. That's why, a great city has like bars and restaurants and other music venues, and it has them all next to each other because it's really nice when you don't have to like go get in a car and go get across town to like go to the music venue. Right? It's right across, and people go straight from the bar to the restaurant. But if the bar is in like one big building and you have to go to the 12th floor, and then the restaurant is like some other building way over here, it's like, yes, technically there is a bar and a restaurant, but they're not intermixing in the way that, like when we talk about blockchain composability, being in the same contiguous space allows them to be a lot more vibrant. It creates a lot more intersections and creativity in the blockchain world that is really valuable.
That's obviously one way to scale a city is building skyscrapers, building up, right? But there are other ways to scale cities, there are other ways to scale communities. And so in your paper, you kind of discuss how to think about the main building blocks in crypto of layer 1 networks, rollups, and also interoperability networks. And so let's transition a little bit and talk about interoperability networks, what those are, and what the analogy might be there.
So interoperability networks, they're a very old idea in crypto. So if you're familiar with Polkadot or Cosmos, these are two of the major interoperability networks in crypto. And essentially what they do is they allow an easy way to launch an application-specific blockchain. An application-specific blockchain is basically a blockchain that's dedicated to only doing one thing, to basically one particular application. So we talked about borrowing and lending on something like Compound or Aave. An application-specific blockchain would be if Compound or Aave created their own blockchain. And on that blockchain, it's not like a general smart contract platform. It's just a place where you can only interact with Compound, or you can only interact with Aave. That's an application-specific blockchain. And when we look at different ways to scale blockchains generally, one of those paths is that applications which are taking up a lot of space on Ethereum or on Avalanche or Solana, they could instead eventually say like, hey, you know what? I'm so important. I'm such a central part of so many people's experience that I'm actually, I can't have these neighbors next to me taking up space and taking up attention and congesting the network. I need to go live by myself and be on my own chain so that people can just interact with me unperturbed. So it's almost as though, if you were, let's say you were a business and you were inside of a skyscraper, and you're like, you know what, Coinbase, we're so big, we have so many employees, what we do is so important, we should just go get our own building. And the only thing in this building is going to be Coinbase, which Coinbase did once upon a time. that, it's sensible to do that, ostensibly, if you are a big enough application. And so, one of the most prominent examples of that today is Axie Infinity. Axie Infinity today, they have their own blockchain. It's called the Ronin blockchain. It's a sidechain on Ethereum. But they basically decided, like, look, we have so much throughput and we have so many individual unique users that we can't just live on another blockchain. We need to have our own chain. And so Cosmos and Polkadot were the original purveyors of this idea of the application-specific blockchain. And this is one vision of how blockchains can scale, is that every individual application develops its own blockchain, and each of these blockchains talk to each other through some kind of highway network or communication system that allows the blockchains to interact and for people to move and capital to move in between the different blockchains. So Polkadot has one vision of how to do this. Cosmos has another vision of how to do this. And the way that I analogize application-specific blockchains as a way to scale is almost like factory towns. So, one thing in the normal world, right? Like if you go drive far enough outside of, a major metropolitan area, you'll find like a factory town, which is a town that's just dedicated to like this factory. Boeing or something has a factory here, and everyone here works for the factory, or everyone here works for NASA, or everyone here works for this, this fabric plant, or this is just a place that the only thing here are outlet stores. And so there's nothing else. There's not really an overall city. There's just outlet stores over here, just like 30 minutes outside of the metro area. And so things like that exist, right? They are definitely a part of the fabric of how cities scale as they move some of their industrial activities outside of the city center in a place where people are willing to go, but it's not, a vibrant place of activity. So I think those will exist, and they clearly already do, right? Axie Infinity is a perfect example of it. But they are not the primary way that economic activity is organized within the normal world, and they're also not the primary way that economic activity is organized within blockchains. So I think that they have a role to play, application-specific blockchains, but they're not the lion's share of where creativity and action is really happening today in blockchains. If you just think about it, without looking at the blockchain side, let's just look at imagining a town, right? There are places where you could go, you could drive 30 minutes out of town and get cheaper prices. If you go to like, the outlet stores or the Walmart or whatever that's like way out in the middle of nowhere. But for most people, they're like, look, I don't want to drive 30 minutes out. Like I'm willing to pay for the convenience of this thing being inside my city, being next to the other things that I care about, being more kind of city-like even in just the culture and the vibe of the thing that's going on, right? Like being in that city center has a lot of other accretive effects because of the fact that it's close to the other things that you care about, and it's being influenced by the other things that you care about. And so the reality is that there are a lot of benefits of being near a city. And it's hard to quantify all of them even, right? It's like hard to put your finger on every single individual little thing, but it's really obvious when you just introspect that, yes, even if I was saving money by going 30 minutes outside the city to like go to, maybe a nice string of bars or a nice outlet store or, a really nice mall, it'd have to be a lot better for me to be willing to do that. Like even if it's just marginally better or moderately better, I wouldn't be willing to do it.
Yeah, so maybe the analogy here, tying it back to crypto, if you're living in New York City, you have your one apartment building and you have everything nearby, right? You don't really have to go too far to get your laundry done, to get your shopping done, to go to the concerts. It's all kind of there for you. You're used to it. You know the plumbing, you know the infrastructure, and it's, a little bit expensive, but whatever, it works. You move to farming towns, well, suddenly you have to find a new apartment, right? And then suddenly you have to travel between them. And so the analogy in crypto would be, look, you have to go across a bridge. You have to transfer your assets from, Ethereum over to Polkadot or Cosmos or one of those hubs or zones. And the infrastructure there is just a little bit more challenging to piece through. Things are a little bit different. You have to get a new wallet. You have to think about block explorers. You have to, if you care about this stuff, think about the security models involved. So there's just more mental overhead involved. Not to mention, if you want to do a specific action, so say you want to play the Ronin game, awesome, go to Ronin, play Axie Infinity there, right? But you can't necessarily do anything else. If you want to do anything else, you got to get off the Ronin chain, go through a bridge again, wait some time, right? And so there's where the usability kind of suffers a little bit. Maybe the question to you though is, do you see a world where these interoperability networks smooth out those infrastructure challenges? Maybe the bridges get really fast. Maybe they get really, maybe the UX, maybe there's one super wallet that connects all the wallets and then suddenly it's just kind of very simple. Well, let's move on to, I know your post sketches out three things, right? It sketches out the rollups, the interoperability networks, and also other layer ones. So we've got New York, we can build skyscrapers, those are rollups. We've got mining towns and, shopping towns and what have you for interoperability networks. What is the example of other layer one networks? What do those represent?
So the most obvious answer of, okay, New York's full. How do we scale New York? The most obvious answer is you start a new city. So, and that is in practice, of course, the answer of like, okay, where do people, when they don't fit in New York, where do they go? They go to other cities. So let's go start Boston. Let's go start Chicago. Let's go start Jersey City. Let's go start, LA. And when you look at these other layer ones, this is kind of the equivalent answer, right? Instead of saying, okay, how do I build Ethereum up? How do I, kind of build outside of the periphery of Ethereum and find one way for one application to scale? Let's instead build a whole new layer one. Now, when you build a whole new city, one of the things that you'll notice almost immediately is that there's a bunch of work that you have to do to start a new city, right? You have to start over. You have to build roads, you have to build police stations and hospitals and schools and all this stuff. You need that foundation before you can then start building a new city. And once you build a new city, now the first thing you'll notice in a new city is that we have a pretty good idea of what's going to work when we start that new city, right? So like, okay, after we build the infrastructure, we're probably going to want a McDonald's. I'm going to guess that people like McDonald's, right? No matter where you are, people are going to like McDonald's. They're going to like Walmart's, So one of the first things you can do, very low risk when you start a new city, is put in a Walmart, put in a McDonald's. People will buy that. Those will be successful businesses, right? The same thing is true for some of the core primitives that we've seen on all these different chains, right? So every chain, there's a successful AMM, a trading platform. There's a successful lending protocol that gets a lot of demand. There's a successful NFT marketplace. Some people want to trade NFTs on every single chain. And so there's some core primitives that we always know in every city that they're going to succeed as long as, there are enough people actually show up in the city for the city to be a city. But what you notice over time, with each of these layer ones, is that they're all different in the way in which they build the city. And this is also true for cities, right? If you look at the major cities in the US, so you've got New York, you've got LA, you've got Chicago, you've got Houston. They're all big cities, but they're all different. And not only are they different in the fact that they're in different places geographically, they have different weather, but even more importantly, they have different cultures, they have different institutions, they have different focuses industrially. So there are different industries that end up characterizing those cities. And you see the exact same thing happening in layer ones. Each of these blockchains, they're very different in their character, very different in their philosophy, and also very different in the kinds of applications that they end up attracting. But each of them is a different approach to how to build a city that could stand potentially toe-to-toe with Ethereum.
Yeah, this is actually why I really like the analogy, because it paints a nice picture of how the social effects are going to play a role in what gets built, right? You have Ethereum as kind of the traditional hub, the financial hub, but people are going to other blockchains because, hey, the vibe is a little bit different. So the question to you is like, are these cities, these different blockchains, building meaningfully different things? Like, say, is one a city in the sky with flying cars? Is another an island in the sea or something, right? Like, are there really meaningful differences, or do you actually see them as kind of really, really essentially similar things, but culture is the predominant difference?
I would say it's very clear that these blockchains are very meaningfully distinct from each other in terms of their technology, in terms of their infrastructure. And this is maybe a little bit where the city's analogies becomes a little rougher. But you can see parts of it, right? Like, LA or Houston are cities that are much more focused on building new infrastructure and building new things, building housing even, right? Whereas New York, like, no shot in hell that any new buildings are going to get built anytime soon.
And governance is very different too, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Governance is very different. Institutions are very different because they're oriented around what the ambition is of the city in terms of what it wants to accomplish as a city. And so you can see the same thing in Solana, right? Solana is a city that's, or a layer one blockchain, that is very committed to the idea that we are going to keep innovating and changing. And they say, like, look, I'm willing to trade off the throughput in order to get better decentralization. And so I think at the end of, in the history of America, obviously, in the rise and fall of civilization, many cities have come and gone. In the history of America, it used to be, of course, that Boston was the capital of America, and it was also the most vibrant city. And it ended up migrating over to New York over time, that New York became the most important city in America, but originally it was not. It's obviously not impossible that happens again. It's not likely, given that New York is twice as large as LA today in terms of population, and it's certainly significantly ahead in terms of the overall market capitalization of all the companies that are based in New York. But it's not impossible to see that that could change. Today, Ethereum is like New York. It's by far the largest blockchain. It has the most market cap. It has the most users. It has the most TVL, or total value, that's locked on Ethereum. But it's not out of the question that if you give it enough years, that there could be enough of a material difference between Ethereum and Solana or Avalanche and Near or Polygon or any of these other blockchains that they could potentially supersede Ethereum. But it's the point of that analogy is that it's certainly not written. I think what you're very likely going to see is that the equilibrium for layer 1 blockchains is going to be very similar to cities in that a small number of cities are going to matter. There's going to be maybe 5 to 10 cities that matter on or layer 1 blockchains that matter on a global scale. But the number 1 blockchain is going to have the lion's share of the overall economic value of blockchains. But that doesn't mean that it's the only one that matters. So the second prediction I make is that layer 2s will exist, they'll be important, but they're not the whole story. They won't be sufficient to really fully scale what people want to do on public blockchains. A third prediction is that interoperability networks and application-specific blockchains will exist, but they'll be a small contributor to the overall scaling story. And then the last major prediction that I make is that interoperability, which is the ability to connect up other layer 1 blockchains together, is going to become really important. That's going to be like sort of the highway system that connects all this stuff together, or the shipping system, or the freight system, or whatever. And right now, the solutions that we have for cross-chain bridging and transmissibility of messages is pretty janky. It's very idiosyncratic. We don't really have like a kind of a global highway system that connects all the blockchains together. But I think we will eventually have that, and whoever manages to build that will probably be able to capture a lot of value.
Yeah, this is why I think mental frameworks are so powerful. They help you kind of think through a very complicated topic with more precision. You can reason about it a little bit better when you have a framework to rely on. And again, this one I think works so well because, again, they're physically constrained networks, and so they're more like cities than they are like the internet or some other network technology. But taking a step back, though, analogies are never perfect, right? I kind of alluded to this in the beginning where I'm like, look, I mean, analogies are great for a lot of things, but they often don't appreciate the full spectrum of nuances. And so this one's powerful in its simplicity and how it's easy to grasp. Maybe I'll ask you one final question here. Are you like bullish or bearish on New York City and its skyscrapers, or other ecosystems, other cities?
I would say I'm bullish, but I'd also say all of the above. Right? I'm bullish on New York and its skyscrapers. I'm bullish on Ethereum. I think Ethereum will continue to succeed, and it's got such a fantastic community and position as the center of gravity of the crypto world and the crypto innovation. Like, still, most of the pitches that we get are people who want to build on Ethereum. But I'm also bullish on the non-Ethereum world. I think if you imagine that blockchain is America, I think that America is gonna win. America is gonna be awesome, and New York is gonna be great. But a lot of other stuff is gonna be great too. So I'm excited about the whole of it.
Yeah, well, Haseeb, this has been great. Super fascinating conversation. I love, again, the mental frameworks. I always try to find the novel new ones and incorporate them into my mental set of how blockchains work. And I thought this one was super powerful as well.
Appreciate that. I appreciate you having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Well, there you have it. I hope you found that analogy as helpful as I did. It certainly does help cut through a lot of the complexity and give a much firmer, clearer grasp on how to think about blockchains. But let me know. Did you find it interesting, exciting? Do you have comments? Are there questions that were left unanswered? Comment at me on Twitter or on YouTube. And also be sure to listen and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And catch us on the web as well, coinbase.com/aroundtheblock. You'll find previous podcast episodes as well as long-form research on topics that we dive into. And as always, I'll see you next week.
Today's conversation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or investment advice. Actual results may vary materially from any forward-looking statements made and are subject to risks and uncertainties.